Hey, my political aficionados, it is time to start a new unit. It's too cold to go outside. I'm going to try to do it in this room. I'll probably be interrupted. That's okay. We adapt and we overcome. This is a great unit, a favorite by many, and it's about the interaction between branches of government. So, in our previous unit, we learned what the branches were, we learned what their powers were, we learned about checks and balances. But they do interact with each other besides just trying to check each other's power. They do need to cooperate and collaborate in order to get things to happen. So we're going to learn a little bit about that. And the first one that we'll learn about today is the legislative branch. That's the House and the Senate, 2.1. So let's start. So first, let's look at the difference in the two parts of our bicameral legislature. The House, because its representation based on population, has 435 members. The Senate, because it's based on 2 per state, only has a 100. So the House has to have at least 1 per state. Some states don't have a huge population. There's more cows than people, but they have at least 1 representative. There's 2 per state regardless of population for the Senate. To be a member of the House of Representatives, you need to be 25 years old, whereas to be a member of the House, you need to be 30. The House has a 2-year term with a much quicker turnover, and the Senate has a 6-year term. Where you can think about the differences in how relationships form and how negotiations come as a result of those relationships just based on that turnover. Quickly turning over means it's less likely to develop those more stable political relationships than 6-year terms. To be a member of the House, you have to come from within that district in your state that you represent. To be in the Senate, you can come from anywhere in the state that you represent. The House, because there is so many more people, their debates need to be more formalized, whereas the Senate, it could be less formal. If you can imagine, if you only have 100 senators, they don't need the same things like time restrictions the way possibly 435 people, if they want to discuss things, would be. So let's discuss a little bit of the formality of the House. So keep in mind right now, our speaker is still officially Nancy Pelosi, but after the midterms, this is being recorded in late November 2022, she did say she will not seek a leadership position now that the House majority will belong to the Republicans. And the new speaker will most likely be Kevin McCarthy. Below him, you see Congressman McGovern, who's a Democrat, I believe from Massachusetts. And he's the head of the Rules Committee on Rules. So that will probably change. Leadership often changes when the majority shifts as well. So what does the Rule Committee do? Well, first think of debate being limited. Like I said, you can't have everyone speak for an unlimited amount of time in the House. So the speaker is who controls who speaks, how much time. Now, the speaker isn't there for every single session, but they'll leave basically someone in charge. And then if someone gets time, they often will divide that time and let others speak during that time. So the Rules Committee is super important to make all this happen. They can speed up or slow down the passage of a bill. They could basically kill a bill before it even makes it to the floor. They have a responsibility to stand in committees and to schedule bills for debate. So which ones are going to be debated on the House floor or not. Now, the Senate is less formal. They have longer debates. They can build coalitions much easier, as we mentioned. There's less hierarchy in the Senate, and they can speak as long as they want. So the only way to try to kill a bill really in a Senate, I shouldn't say the only way, but one way is by filibuster. And I see here an image from 1964. So the civil rights legislation, which many senators did not want to pass. One way they were doing that for a long while was by filibustering. Right now, the Senate Majority Leader, as you see here, is Chuck Schumer from New York. So let's talk a little bit about these coalitions, and I'll give you some examples, some current examples of coalitions. So you can have a basic coalition, which is unofficial, but it's like a group of congressmen or women that sort of stick together to try to get passage certain types of legislation. So a common one you'll hear in the news these days is informally known as the Squad. So we have here Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, Congresswoman Alexandria, you would know her as AOC probably, right? Cortez of New York. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is over to the right. And then Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. Now there's two more who've sort of grown onto this squad. Jamal, I think I wrote this down, Bueno of New York, and then Cori Bush as well. So they often see eye to eye on many different types of legislation. So they sort of work together as a group to get that happen. Some people like it, some people don't. That's politics. So that would be like a subgroup. Next, we can have a bipartisan coalition. So here's an example of a bipartisan coalition. This was an infrastructure group, and this is from July of, I would say, 2021 maybe, and trying to get an infrastructure bill passed. So it's easier to get a bill passed if it's bipartisan and you get members of both sides. So this would be a bipartisan coalition. So here you see, these are all senators. Rob Portman, the Republican of Ohio, I'm going like left to right. Bill Casey, a Republican. John Tester, who's a Democrat. Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican. Susan Collins, who's a Republican. Kristen Sinema, who's a Democrat. Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat. And then Mark Warner, who's a Democrat. Now, something interesting to note as well is that two of the Democrats I mentioned, Sinema and Manchin, often side with the Republicans on legislation. And two of the Republicans I mentioned, Murkowski and Collins, often side with Democrats, especially if it's more related to like women's rights and women's health and things like that. So it's also important to remember that just because you belong to a party doesn't mean you need to vote that party's platform line 100% of the time. Most do, but not all. But either way, you can see why this would sort of be a natural bipartisan group. And of course, you have the president in there as well, showing an example of the interaction of the branches. You can also have coalitions within states. So congressmen and senators wanting to get something advanced in their state working together. So our senators here in New Jersey are both Democrats, Junior Senator Cory Booker and Senior Senator Robert Menendez. And above him is a congressman of the 8th District, Ceres. And they were working here together, I guess, it looks like it was about climate action. So that would be an example of a state coalition. You also have interstate coalitions, which are if there's several states that have something they want to advance, whether it be environment or maybe something to do with highways that go through both their states or something like that. Okay. Now, enumerated and implied powers. So this is important to understand the difference. So you have enumerated and implied. Enumerated powers are things specifically mentioned by Congress that are and by the Constitution, that are the powers held by people in Congress, whether it's the House or the Senate. So you have the ones that we know more commonly: to collect taxes, right? The power of the purse, to borrow money, right? To coin money, to provide and maintain a navy. So all of these enumerated powers are in Article 1, Section 8, right? The power to create a post office and roads so the post office can get their mail places, declare war, right? Implied powers are different. Oh, and these are even more enumerated powers, right? There's a lot. Remember, the legislative branch, Article 1, is the longest part of the Constitution, right? And there's a reason for that. All right, so implied powers, they all come from the necessary and proper clause. So it's, oh, well, we think this is necessary and proper. If we think it is, then it becomes their power. This is also known as the elastic clause. This gives them a lot of leeway right? And it makes room also for a lot of debate, right? Is this really necessary? Is this proper? When we think of the court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, right? The idea was that to create a bank, the government needed to create a bank that they found was necessary and proper because that tied in with their ability to collect taxes. You also have examples of conscription, right? So if you declare war, it might be necessary and proper to have a draft. And we saw this in the Civil War, World War II, Korea, and even the lottery draft here we saw in Vietnam. Necessary and proper also gave Congress the power to create everyone's favorite group, the IRS. This was created in 1862. And the idea is that because Congress has the enumerated power to collect taxes, they then have the necessary and proper power to manage that process. And the IRS would help them make that possible. Another implied power comes the power to make a national minimum wage. They believe this comes out of the Commerce Clause, right? Because in order for goods to be transported and sold between states, you need a competitive wage between those states as well. And then also national health care, that comes from an implied power as well, because there's a section of the Constitution that says they have a power for the general welfare, right? Is that pretty broad? That's pretty broad too. So they believe that healthcare fits under that. They also believe it's protected under the right to collect taxes because Medicare and Medicaid come from that, and they believe that also gives them the power for Medicare systems. So it's important to remember that Congress has the power of the purse. So that's in Section 7. Clause 1, So bills for raising revenue shall come from the House, right? The people should determine if there's reason to collect taxes. And then we also see it in Section 9, Clause 7. All right, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, blah, 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 right? Unless public money shall be published from time to time. So if there's a power that comes to deal with money, taxes, revenue, it basically always comes from the power of Congress, right? The president can't raise taxes. The Supreme Court can't raise taxes. They can support it, they can encourage it, but it comes down to Congress. All right, so Congress also then has to pass the budget, right? So the executive branch can suggest a budget. They can request a budget, but it's up to Congress to pass it. And you see that a lot in the news, and you'll be seeing that again pretty soon now that the midterm elections are over. And also comes with coining money and all that sorts of stuff. So those are some more specifics on the legislative branch. We'll get you some more specifics soon on the other branches. And also we're going to start seeing examples of these different enumerated and implied powers happening in our government today. All right, stay tuned because there's more.